I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we'll talk about the continuing battle in the Donbas, the fire at Russia's Bryansk fuel depot, and the impact of Emmanuel Macron's victory in the French presidential election.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, I sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's the 25th of April, day 61, and today I'm joined by Defence and Security Editor Nicholls, Deputy Foreign Editor Theo Murz, and Mutaz Ahmed from our comment team. I started by asking Dom for the latest updates from the front line.
Hi David, hi everybody. It's been a frustrating weekend, I think, for all sides. This move into the Donbas from Russian forces hasn't really gained any ground. There's been a lot of pushing and shoving, basically. So from the north, Russian forces have been trying to spread out their resupply lines and the logistic corridors that they're establishing from the Russian border down to the east of Kharkiv, down into the Donbas. They've been fairly limited, as we saw in the north of the country around Kyiv, fairly limited in their routes. Not yet got great off-route mobility. The ground still isn't good enough for that. So they are somewhat limited in their routes, but they've also self-limited, as we saw in the north. So there has been Ukraine has tried to push back against this. Kharkiv is still holding, still being shelled, still being hit by long-range missile and artillery strikes. However, there are coherent military forces in that area. They've tried to push to the east to cut off these Russian supply lines. They've not really been able to, and they've not really gone into it in the numbers they need. So the military assessment is that they'd need about a brigade's worth of troops with very large numbers of artillery and support, and possibly the same number, about a brigade of troops again in reserve, if they really wanted to push out sort of 50, 60 Ks to try and cut off these supply lines. That would be a great risk for them, because they could easily be encircled and defeated themselves. So there's been no massive effort from brigade in the north, from Ukraine in the north to cut off those lines. So it's largely been Russia trying to inch forward, Ukraine interdicting where they can with fires, but not an awful lot happening. In the south, around the city of Kherson, Russia did try to push out from there, sort of north of Zaporizhia and west of Mykolaiv, but those attacks were repulsed, and the movement, the lines haven't really changed in the south. And similarly in the centre, around Izium and in sort of main the central part of the Donbas. Again, a number of Russian attacks were attempted. The latest British Ministry of Defence analysis says that they were all repulsed, but none of these were properly joined up at anything other than a very tactical level. So we're still not seeing the effect of the new supposedly coherent Russian command and control infrastructure that's been laid over this battle. So it's all a little bit piecemeal at the moment.
Thanks, Dom. Mutaz and Theo, anything to add to that?
Well, I think Dom has said everything that has been happening over the weekend, but the main thing today and overnight has been, as you say, what appears to be a missile strike on a Russian facility in Bryansk, just over the border. It's the building and arms depot is on fire now, and it could be a strike from the Ukrainian side. We don't know exactly what it is yet, but that seems to be the most likely explanation. And it's part of a pattern of attacks or sabotage happening within Russia. It's Ukraine going behind enemy lines, not just repulsing Russian forces in their own country, but trying to hamper the invasion by hitting targets in in Russia itself, and we've seen that a few times over the last few weeks, on depots such as these, and also on train tracks over the border in Russia, that would obviously limit Russia's ability or hamper Russia's ability to get further troops and supplies into Ukraine. So that may be something to watch out for today, certainly something to watch out for today, and maybe in the weeks to come.
Thanks, Theo. I just have a quick question about that, because if this is obviously hypothetical, but if it is confirmed that this is a Ukrainian strike, what would that tell us about the Ukrainian offensive capacity, and whose weapons would they be using? And is this something that the Western powers who are arming and funding Ukraine would be encouraging of, or would this mark an escalation?
Well, I can take that one if you like. I think it's interesting you use the phrase escalation there. We'll come back to that in just a moment. But these strikes, as Theo says, there's been a few just recently. April the 1st, there was a strike on the Belgorod oil facility, which we think now, although Ukraine didn't admit liability at the time, we think was conducted by Mi-24 Hind attack helicopters. Then on April the 12th, there was the rail lines. Obviously, we've had the Moskva sinking, the Neptune missiles in the Black Sea. And last week, don't forget, there was the Central Research Institute of the Russian Aerospace Forces that suddenly went up in flames about 100 miles northwest of Moscow. So there's a number of things happening here. It's unlikely that the attack in Moscow, and there was also a chemical plant to the east of Moscow that provides precursor materials for explosives, that also went up in flames last Thursday. Unlikely that those two were Ukrainian strikes. And I think this Bryansk strike that's still burning now, probably about 100 k's north of the border, sort of directly north of, go to the border from Kharkiv, keep going north about 100 k's. So that's quite a long way for an attack helicopter raid, not out of range of missiles. And we think Ukraine does have ballistic missiles that's able to reach that far. So don't think that would be any Western supplied weaponry. But at the same time, also reported this morning, just as those strikes were occurring in Bryansk, there were two drones, allegedly Ukrainian drones, shot down in the Kursk region. So this is between Belgorod and the Russia-Ukraine border. So a good sort of 150 k's away from the site of the strikes. But it's interesting. So Russian state media are saying that they are Ukrainian drones. Now they might have been having a look around for future strikes. They may have been some sort of diversion. We were told when the Moskva was hit that there was a very obvious drone very near the ship, which had drawn a lot of the crew's attention, possibly aiding in the strike or possibly just a diversion. But all these things together do suggest that the Ukrainian forces are pretty skillful at doing these tactical actions, these either soft raids, special ops forces raids, or air assault or missile strikes. These raids that do have military utility. They're not just a sort of an embuggerance, as much of the Russian forces seem to be just firing artillery around just to for want of something better to do. So these strikes they do have military utility. They also have great information utility. I mean, just the news of these strikes plays very well, but has another effect as well. So there was an article in the FT, the Financial Times, over the weekend saying that actually Putin might have been coming around to the idea that of approaching negotiations with a bit more a commitment until the Moskva was sunk. So we should be careful not to say that these things are escalatory, because that sort of puts them into a special bracket, and I don't think they are. I mean, this is war. Ukraine has been invaded. Russia is conducting strikes across the border into Ukraine. It's entirely legitimate that Ukraine strikes back, and the more we allow these types of strikes to be couched in the terms of escalatory, it plays into Putin's hands, I feel. So I don't think we need to use that kind of language. I don't think it's escalatory. I think it's very sensible use of limited resource. It does beg the question, though, where this is going, because, as we said last week, if Ukraine are now doing these attacks to raise the cost of this misadventure for Putin, that's one thing. But these in and of themselves are not going to end the war. So you do have to question when positioned for any future negotiations, quite how helpful these are. So, for example, going for oil facilities and logistic facilities north of the border has an immediate impact, or very, very rapid impact into the battle for the Donbas. Some other strikes that might be suggested, for example, attacking the Crimea bridge that Russia built in 2018, opened in 2018 and 2019 for the rail link, linking mainland Russia to Crimea. I mean, that's very totemic. How much military utility that would offer is debatable. How difficult it would be, how much precision-guided munition expenditure it would take is debatable. So, got to ask how much is worth doing, how much is worth employing to try and get these targets. So, there's an interesting balance there between Russia's model of just sort of grinding on with its armour and firing long-range missiles and artillery that's bringing such misery to the civilian population in Ukraine, vice the effort that Ukraine's doing anyway, and then these very, very sophisticated long-range deep strikes.
Thanks, Dom. Mutaz, would you like to come in on this? Add anything to this?
Sure. I think a British foreign policy analyst would say it's in everyone's interests that Ukraine denies conducting any of these attacks, because, you know, you don't want to give Russia justification for conducting direct attacks on, let's say, the presidential palace in Kiev, which, you know, if Putin believes that a strike on Russia was ordered by Kiev, then perhaps he may see that as reason to attempt to decapitate the Ukrainian government, which is something we don't want. The British position is that the British government wants Russia to fail in Ukraine, which is an indirect way of saying, you know, the British government wouldn't really condone expanding the war to Russia as well. But it's deeply embarrassing that a country that claims to be a great power, Russia, is experiencing these things. You know, Russia goes around the world telling African nations and South American nations and Arab nations that it can supply them with the weapons to defend themselves, and yet it's becoming clear that Russia can't defend itself from really a medium to small-sized country. That's very embarrassing. And it adds to this sense that the Russian military is a paper tiger. You know, in the first stage of the war, we saw that the Russian army had deep logistical problems, but there was this sense when they withdrew from the area surrounding Kiev and you know they regrouped and said they would go into Donbas and focus there. There was this sense that we would see finally this Russian might, you know, this great lion that you know we've been imagining. You know, it would come back. You know, the first stage could be written off as just a lack of planning or whatever. But what we see actually is that those problems run very deep. This is the same Russian army. They're experiencing the same issues. Not much has changed. And now you're seeing serious military people and strategic thinkers. You know, people like Professor Phillips O'Brien, who's a strategic academic, saying that the Russian army may not be able to survive in Donbas. Soon they'll be reliant on conscripts. Their morale is even lower there in Donbas than it was in the first stage of the war, because you're sending the same troops, you know, who've just suffered defeat. You know, they've just had to conduct war crimes. You're sending them back into battle without much time to rest. You know, what do you expect? So the Donbas question is still very open, and we're seeing really a military incapable of conducting any sort of war of conquest. It's very embarrassing for Russia.
Thanks, Mutaz. Theo and Dom, anything to pick up on there?
I would direct, if anybody wishes to sort of have another little read of this, I've written in today's Ukraine newsletter about possibly one of the reasons for this, the fact that Russia's just not as good as they thought they were going to be, let alone anyone else. And it's partly to do with the way Putin's leadership style of you know, leading by fear, basically, but also he surrounded himself with intelligence officers or people from an intelligence background rather than a broad mix of state, civil society, military, etc., etc. And there's a very, very different attitude to information from intelligence agencies to many others. And when we talk about operational security, OPSEC, it's very much in the intelligence agencies' sort of DNA to not want to give information out. Now, of course, there is OPSEC, there is operational security. I'm not suggesting that people should just be carefree with this information. But the fact that so much of the Russian military didn't seem to know until a number of hours before the invasion that they were actually going to war, and there have been reports that some POWs have been picked up thinking they were still on a training exercise. I mean, this is just extraordinary that the chain of command didn't allow information to flow so freely in the right, so information got to the right place at the right time. And I think it just speaks of this whole chain of command and the way that Putin sort of surrounded himself with this coterie of not only sort of yes men, but people for whom just they're very reluctant to give any information out at all. I would contrast that with the information. I don't want to use information space; it's a horrible phrase, but the information environment, if you like, yes, because environments are completely different to spaces. Information environment here in the West, which we kind of struck a chord after the Skripal attack in 2018, when the Russian GRU used nerve agent in Salisbury in southern England, supposedly to try and kill Sergei Skripal, who had been a KGB agent defected to the UK, and it was deemed after that Theresa May's government said that they needed to get some very, very sensitive information into the public domain, and the immediate answer was no, it can't happen. And she said no. Let's imagine it's a movie and that we have done it. Now let's go back and read the script and see how it happened. Basically, I'm paraphrasing. And there was some very sensitive information put into the public domain, and we see that happening today. So I get briefed regularly by Western officials, as you will read in the Telegraph and elsewhere. All the main media outlets are invited, and it's up to you, the reader and the listeners, to decide whether, when Dom says a Western official said this, if it's me making it up, if it's somebody I heard on the bus, or if it's a genuinely knowledgeable and a person in the correct position to know what they're talking about. So, I can't make your mind up for you. You've just got to decide that. But I think it's very interesting the way that information is being used here, and Russia has kept it so tight that they've not really been able to get the right information at the right time to the right place. Apart from that truthful, or seemingly that truthful hernia a couple of weeks ago when they suddenly said that the main objective is the Donbas all along, which I think was extraordinary. If that is the case, they used it to cover up the failures in the north. But I think it's extraordinary that a military at war, a nation at war, suddenly unveils what's the main objective. So the way information is used is very interesting on both sides, and it does have a real effect on the ground.
Thank you very much, Dom. Can we talk a little bit now about the US Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State who visited Ukraine over the weekend? Why were they there, and what was agreed when they were there? Theo and Mutaz, maybe you should lead on this.
Yeah, so Antony Blinken was in Kiev over the weekend, and it's the first time with the US Secretary of Defense. It's the first time that such senior US officials, or any US officials at all really, have been in Ukraine since the start of the conflict. And primarily it's a show of support. It's like Boris Johnson, Ursula von der Leyen, other European leaders going to Ukraine and meeting with Zelensky while this fighting is going on. It shows that he has this broad international coalition that are supporting him. And on the practical side, the US announced hundreds of millions more dollars in support for fighting Russia. I think it was 300 million that they announced over the weekend. And they also said that US diplomats would start moving back to Kiev in the coming weeks. They obviously pulled out along with most other Western embassy staff in the weeks leading up to the war. And that was a move that was really criticised by Zelensky personally and Ukraine in general, saying that we don't feel like we do actually have your support if you're if you're not there. And it was also at the time when nobody, apart from Western intelligence officials, seemed quite sure that this invasion was going to happen. So the US and other embassies were accused of escalating the situation by pulling out. But moving back, it's obviously a good sign for Kiev. It shows that it's getting safer, that foreign diplomats will be there, but also, just like Blinken's visit, it's a show of support and a show that Ukraine is still part of the international community in the way that Russia very much isn't. A lot of diplomats from both sides, from Russia and the West, been expelled in the last few months, and Russia becoming more and more isolated.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. It's very symbolic. It follows on from Italy and the UK announcing that their embassies are reopening in Kiev. It's a symbolic sort of statement that these countries believe Ukraine has secured its independence. This was the important thing, I think, for many British diplomats. What I heard at the start of the war is the most important thing is that Ukraine secures its capital, because by securing its capital, it secures its independence. And yes, of course, there's a war rumbling on in the south and in Donbas, but for as long as there's a functioning government in Kiev, you've got an independent nation that we can recognize as the West. And so that's very important. But these visits also serve a practical purpose. The first is that you actually make Kiev safer if you have a regular flow of Western officials, Western diplomats, senior government officials into the capital. You make things safer for government officials there, because Vladimir Putin, the Russian military, are a lot less likely to lob bombs over or to conduct strikes when there's a risk of killing a US or British or Italian diplomat. So that's one practical purpose. The other is that diplomacy, there's a reason diplomats prefer to meet in person, which is that you have a different dimension when it's person to person. You can have a greater effect. Many diplomatic successes have been achieved, with off-the-cuff conversations, pulling someone aside, showing someone something, experiences. These things still matter, even in this age, in diplomacy. And so having Blinken there and having Lloyd there, that's really important for securing more money and so on. So the Ukrainians have done well to attract these officials. I think Zelensky made a slight error in announcing the visit before it occurred. I don't think the Americans wanted that to happen for security reasons, but it all worked out in the end. And yes, there's more support going to Ukraine, and hopefully more embassies will start moving back into Kiev. I think they think that's really important.
Any more thoughts from you, Dom, on the US visit, or shall we move on to talk about the French elections?
A couple of quickies, if I may, on the US visit. So, Secretary Blinken's also confirmed that President Biden is going to nominate Bridget Brink, who's currently the US ambassador to Slovakia, to be the next US ambassador to Ukraine. Bridget Brink is she's had experience in Uzbekistan and Georgia, so she's well versed in the region, and so a lot of money was announced, and I'd be really interested in any of our US listeners or anybody who understands the way that the finance works in the US could get in touch, please. I'm looking at I've got the statement here from the US Embassy here in London, talking about the details, and they said that Secretary Blinken also said that $713 million from the foreign military financing for Ukraine and 15 other allied and partner nations in Central and Eastern Europe and the Balkan region will be made available. So it's a lot of money, but suddenly then it's spread a bit more thinly. This includes $650 million in funding provided by the Ukraine Supplemental Appropriations Act. More than $322 million of this obligation is for Ukraine and will provide support for the capabilities Ukraine needs as Russia's forces train their focus on the Donbas. So I'm not sure how much of this is new money for Ukraine and whether or not they don't talk about any specific natures of equipment. They do talk about some of it will be used to help NATO allies backfill capabilities they've donated to Ukraine. So, I can't quite work out how much, if there's any additional money here for equipment. Although it does say that $165 million has been made available for non-standard ammunition for Ukraine. And I wonder if that's for ammunition, to buy ammunition that is not currently in service with the US or other NATO allies. But like I say, so there was a bit of sort of number crunching going on there, and if there was any contributors any listeners from the US who are able to kind of DM us or drop us a line to explain whether or not any of this is new money and new equipment, and quite what it means, the foreign military financing in particular, I'd be very interested. So thanks.
So let's talk a little bit about the French elections. How did the war in Ukraine play in the French elections, and what's the impact of Macron's overwhelming win?
Well, the war in Ukraine did have an impact in it, in that Macron was very late into the campaign because he was so focused on the shuttle diplomacy with Putin and Zelensky and playing a role in that, which, when the polls were slightly tightening in the last couple of weeks and it looked like Le Pen might have been in with a very outside chance, there was this criticism that he'd been too focused on international affairs and not enough on domestic issues like cost of living crisis and his plans to raise the retirement age, etc. And also the war played a significant role in that when Macron and Le Pen did come head to head for their one TV debate ahead of the second round on Sunday, Macron really laid into Le Pen over her ties to Russia, or what he said were her ties to Russia, because she took this, or her party took this bank loan from a Russian bank, which he said made her beholden to the Putin regime. And that was part of I wouldn't say it was a turning point, because obviously it was widely known that her party had taken this loan, but it was part of his attack on her, which proved ultimately to be successful. And as we now know, he has won the election with a wider margin than many of the polls predicted. So yes, it did play a role. And in terms of what is going to happen after the election, now that Macron has won, he may not be quite as involved in the international response to Ukraine as he has been. And that's because this domestic political battle in France isn't quite over yet. He's got parliamentary elections coming up in June, and that will determine who he can have as his prime minister, whether he continues to have a parliamentary majority that allows him to push through the reforms that he says he wants to get done. And it looks like parties on the hard right, like Le Pen, and the radical left, like Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who came third in the presidential election, they're both trying to win seats. So Macron is, and look likely to gain seats. So Macron is going to have this domestic political balancing act for at least the next couple of months. It's not the case that he's won, okay, he can get back to being this figure on the European and world stage. So we may not see such a large French involvement, though it goes without saying that Ukraine is very pleased that Marine Le Pen didn't win the election. Zelensky spoke out in support of Macron, and opposition figures in Russia, like the jailed opposition leader Alexei Navalny, also called on French people not to vote for Le Pen, again, because of these perceived ties to Russia and her praise for President Putin in the past.
Mutaz, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, just two things. On the US, it's good to hear from Dom that they've named a candidate to be US ambassador to Ukraine. But we should remember that there was a vacancy for about 2 years, I think, for that role. Obviously, the US had representatives in Ukraine, but that should tell you something about Western complacency. And you had a new president come in, but still, there hasn't been a US ambassador to Ukraine for 2 years. And on France, as Theo was saying, something very interesting happened during the campaign. During the campaign, we saw Macron's position on Ukraine toughen. There was a real sort of paradigm shift. You started seeing he stopped. First of all, he stopped calling Putin. He'd had enough of Putin. This language of continued dialogue ended. You started seeing French officials releasing intelligence about the activities of Russian mercenaries in West Africa, where France has an interest. That's something they weren't doing much of before, and so you saw a shift in Paris towards the Anglo-American position, a much tougher line on Ukraine. And crucially, this was a shift away from Berlin. It was a shift away from the German line. And so it was ironic last night that, people are right that Le Pen would have been a much harder thing for the EU. But last night you saw the beginning of of last 2 weeks, you saw the beginning of some dysfunction in the Franco-German axis in the EU, in that Germany is much more isolated now, much more isolated. You're probably going to see now a push by the French for an oil embargo, which is something that Scholz has said he's very uncomfortable with. You may see more weapons being transferred. And so the EU today, in terms of Ukraine, ironically, is more divided probably than it was before the campaign. And so that's something to watch out for. There is much less agreement now between Macron and Scholz than there was a few weeks ago.
Fascinating. Thank you very much, Mutaz, and thank you, Theo. Theo, there's an extremely interesting piece on the Telegraph website where we talk to the Russian mayor of Dnipro, who has a British-made rocket launcher in his private bar. Can you tell us about that?
Oh, yes. This is a great dispatch from one of our correspondents who's there at the moment, Campbell McDermott. And it's the mayor of Dnipro, who, as Cam says in his piece, is a Russian speaker, is this sort of very gruff, not in an unflattering way, but a bit of a Soviet hangover, perhaps. And he seems like the sort of person, when you meet him, that would exactly be the kind of politician in Ukraine who would naturally support Putin and or at least naturally be closer to Russia and closer to a Russian mentality than a Western mentality. But the war has obviously completely changed this and really pushed him towards the West. And he was talking about his support for that. Even though he grew up in a Russian speaking environment, and his wife is Russian, I think he now feels very culturally Western, and he was talking about his supports for LGBT rights, which is obviously something that Russia and the West diverge on. So it's interesting. It's something that we've been talking about throughout the war, but it's a really good sort of personal illustration of how Putin has entirely alienated people who might otherwise be seen as pro-Russian, and how there's not going to be a natural Russian support base, even if he does succeed in taking the parts of the Donbas that he apparently wants to now.
Thank you very much, Theo. And I would recommend everybody go to the Telegraph website and read that piece. It's hugely interesting. Quickly, before we finish, in my notes, I've written a piece of news that came in on live blog about how Russia says they see no risks in Moldova's breakaway region of Transnistria and wants a peaceful settlement of the situation there. This comes after Rustem Minikayev, the deputy commander of Russia's central military district, was quoted by Russian state news agencies as saying full control over southern Ukraine would give it access to Transnistria. I thought this was interesting because this goes back to Russia's revised war aims, and I realise we haven't actually spoken about what exactly Transnistria is. Can we talk a little bit about that, please?
I better take this. I haven't revised its exact status, but it is a breakaway region of Moldova that is officially part of Moldova but is one of these territories in the former Soviet Union that has a ambiguous status. It's got its own currency. It's hard to travel to. It's a bit. I've heard from people who've been there that it's a bit of a Soviet time warp when you do actually go there. And there was some suggestion at the start of the war, or sort of in the first few weeks of the war, that Russia might extend its action in Ukraine to take this region from Moldova, this that has this ambiguous frozen status at the moment. And then in the last few weeks, we haven't heard so much about it. But as you say, these comments over the weekend raised the possibility that Russia might be moving into Moldova again. So that's possibly something to watch out for.
All I'll add to that is we should always bear in mind Russian communications, strategic communications, generally come out of one of three pots, and it's divert, deny, or discredit. If they don't like what's happening, or wish to make you look at the shiny thing over there rather than what's happening over here. And I think this one comes out of the purely straight out of the divert pot. I mean, we've not heard about Russian fears for Russian-speaking population in Moldova for pretty much up to now in this war, and yet suddenly it's now sort of verging on a war aim, and we should all go. I mean, this is a side order. I mean, do look into it so that we're aware of the issues and we're better armed for when these arguments come out. But I wouldn't worry about spending too much of everyone's busy days looking at this. This is straight out of the divert pot of Russian strategic communications.
Thanks, Dom. Well, I think our time together here is probably up. Can we just talk a little bit, each of you, can I ask you for your final thoughts, and what should we be looking for this week?
Last one for me would be to keep an eye on Antony Blinken and Lloyd Austin's visit from Ukraine. They're coming back. They're going to be stopping off at a location in Europe, which I've been invited to tomorrow. And they're going to talk at this defence consultative meeting. They're going to talk about aid, increased aid for Ukraine, and the next steps. And interestingly, they're going to be talking about the longer term national security interests. So not only interesting that it's happening, but interesting that the vision is being pushed out from the immediate equipment requirements onto the sort of longer term politics. But I'll be able to, if I can't dial in tomorrow from where we are, certainly I'll get a report up, and we'll be able to chat about it on Wednesday.
And I think one of the things to look out for is attacks on the south of Ukraine and civilian areas. Obviously, one of the stories we saw from the weekend was the missile strikes on residential apartment blocks in Odessa. A woman killed along with her 3-month-old baby, which was an awful human story from the conflict, but sadly not so uncommon. And I think that may be a flashpoint in terms of fighting in the days to come.
Mutaz, would you like the final words?
Sure. I'll be watching, as Theo said, the south as well, Odessa. If you'd like to know why that particular city is so important in terms of access to the Black Sea and so on, and its historical importance, go and read David Abilafia on the Telegraph. And frankly, if Russia is able to build a corridor in southern Ukraine, the truth is that breakaway region of Moldova becomes low-hanging fruit. They'd have very easy access to it. And the second thing I'd watch is Macron and Scholz. Scholz was the first person Macron called after winning last night. Of course he was. And these two, I think, over the coming 2 weeks or so, are going to hammer out Europe's position, or at least the Franco-German position, because as we've seen with Poland and so on, the EU is no longer united on Ukraine. But they're going to hammer out what Berlin and Paris think in terms of how this war should go and how Europe should respond, and that's going to be a very important sort of strategic moment. So I'd watch out for that.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. Today, Ukraine the Latest was produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and on Twitter, Alice Hearing.